We are joined now, I believe, by Congresswoman Lauren Boebert, who is in the firing line in the wake of the State of the Union address. Now, I don't know if you saw this, but Jen Psaki has come on and said, in response to a question about whether or not why they didn't mention January 6th, that they didn't have time to fit everything into the State of the Union address. And Congresswoman, you were reacting because as Joe Biden is speaking, he is not referencing the 13 different soldiers that we lost in Afghanistan, and you yelled out to him. What has the reaction been since you did that, and what do you think of Joe Biden not having the time to actually address that? We now have the cut for people who might not have heard it last night. Here's what it sounded like.
A cancer that would put them in a flag-draped coffin. I know.
13.
One of those soldiers was my son, Major Bo Biden.
Congresswoman, what's the reaction been again, and what do you think about Biden not having the time to mention the 13 Afghan soldiers we lost in Afghanistan?
So, Buck, when I heard Joe Biden trying to win political points by talking about troops that were being buried in flag-draped coffins, my mind went straight to the 13 servicemen and women that died in Afghanistan. The mother of one of those soldiers lives in my district, and she told me that Joe Biden killed her son. Last night, Joe Biden certainly had time to invite a big tech CEO to the State of the Union, but couldn't bother to recognize any of the families whose loved ones were lost in Afghanistan. I think the reaction that we are getting from me saying, you put them in there, 13 of them in those flag-draped coffins, we're getting a lot of people saying thank you, because these 13 service members would not have been mentioned, would not have been brought up had that reaction not taken place last night. It's not something that I had planned. But also, Buck, the left is really upset at me for interrupting Joe Biden's speech. But I would like them to just sit back and think how upsetting it is for the families whose lives are completely interrupted by Joe Biden's failure. And, we understand that time is very valuable for Joe. There's only so many hours that he's awake during the day. It takes him away from ice cream and applesauce and, dwelling in the basement or fake White House sets, whatever it is that he does. But he showed us that he did not have time for those 13 soldiers way before last night's State of the Union. Remember at that service for the fallen soldiers, he was checking his watch then. He showed America then he did not have time for them.
Media who are scolding you on a decorum level here. As soon as I saw that, there's Tapper over at CNN. He's always the chief hall monitor for all things that Republicans say that he doesn't like. But I remember Nancy Pelosi ripping up the State of the Union address. I remember other times where people have acted out and spoken out during it. What do you want to say to people who are yelling at you essentially that this was a breach of decorum?
I really don't give a darn about a breach of decorum when our 13 service members were completely ignored by the man responsible for their deaths. And who is CNN to talk about decorum? We've all seen what takes place on their Zoom videos and, what the disgusting things that come out of CNN. And, of course, Nancy Pelosi shredding President Trump's State of the Union speech like she's something. I don't give a darn about decorum. The People's House has been completely destroyed this past year. There was fencing all around the Capitol again last night because this is a tremendous symbolism of how the people are not in control of what happens here any longer. This is Pelosi's house, and we are under one-party Democrat rule, and what they say goes. And there's no policy that we can point to that is benefiting any American right now coming from the Democrats. Last night at the State of the Union, members of Congress were required to have PCR testing to test for COVID-19, to have a special golden ticket to enter the House chambers. And on that ticket, it would say whether the members of Congress were seated on the House floor or in the gallery. Members were not allowed to have an invited guest as they usually are. And we were supposed to socially distance in our assigned seating. How crappy and un-American is that? Buck, I'll tell you right now, I did not get tested. I did not have a golden ticket. I did not have an assigned seat. And I sat wherever the heck I wanted to last night. And I was in my workplace, the House chambers, and I was going to be there unrestrained.
Congresswoman, what do you think about the fact that suddenly the mask mandate was gone just in time for the State of the Union? And Joe Biden, who they've kept in a mask for 2 straight years, suddenly out of his mask, walking down, shaking hands, engaging in some sort of odd headbutt with a couple of different people. How hypocritical did it feel to suddenly have the mask mandate gone just in time for Joe Biden's address?
Well, I'm curious if they actually did that because they know that a lot of our masks say things like, I don't know, let's go Brandon. And maybe they didn't want that displayed there in the House chambers. But it is a State of the Union miracle that suddenly we don't need masks in the House chambers. Now, the Senate, they have never had a mask requirement, and there aren't any mask requirements outside of the House chambers that have any repercussion if you break them. So members of Congress were fined up to $2,500. I've been fined a couple times for violating the mask rule in the House chambers. But I told Nancy Pelosi to kiss my mask a long time ago, so I haven't been playing that game. It's been political theater from the start because members of Congress were only fined where the C-SPAN cameras were rolling. But, Buck, we saw just the day before the State of the Union, on Monday, we saw Joe Biden at the White House walking through an empty field with a mask on while he was completely alone. And then last night, slobbering all over Democrats. I even posted a video saying, hey, look at this. We no longer have to socially distance because science. And that's the game that Americans are so sick and tired of. They bound our children. They muzzle our children in schools with these masks, and they do whatever the heck they want. And we are tired of it.
We're speaking to Congresswoman Boebert of Colorado. And Congresswoman, I just want to ask before we let you go, are you and your Republican colleagues in the House as fired up as can be after what felt like a very weak speech from Joe Biden? And do you have a 40 or 50 seat swing toward the Republicans in mind going into this, along with your own reelection, of course?
Look, I would love a red wave. And if we keep showing the American people that we can take a stand and we will do what we promised to do, then we absolutely will take back the House in 2022, where we could start to have real investigations into the origin of COVID, into the NIH, the WHO, into Fauci, our elections in 2020, and so much more, including the border at Afghanistan, and even energy. I serve on the Natural Resources Committee. I would love to have investigations into our energy policies here in America and hold people accountable. But here's the thing, Buck. We need to elect conservatives. We need to elect principled conservatives whose R behind their name does not stand for rollover. Unfortunately, I see a lot of those in Congress now, and we need to make sure that we're not bringing in more of those. So 40, 50 seat swing, sure, maybe. But honestly, I would love a smaller majority. So every vote actually counts. And they have to consider the consequences of every single vote rather than just saying, we got a big majority. It doesn't really matter.
Congresswoman, appreciate the time. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks so much, Buck.
Larry Kudlow is also joining now. The Fox News media contributor. His show Kudlow airs at 4 p.m. Eastern on Fox Business Network. And Mr. Kudlow served as assistant to the president for economic policy and director of the National Economic Council. Larry, great to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. The name's Kudlow, by the way.
Thank you, sir. So tell us this. The Chinese situation right now vis-a-vis Russia and sanctions, piece right now in the Washington Post. China not emerging as lifeline for sanction-slammed Russian economy. What do you see with this?
Yeah, China's backing off. They haven't thrown in completely with Russia. I mean, they're not exactly in the Western alliance. But it is interesting to me that they have backed off what I would consider total support for Russia. And by the way, China has links to the Ukraine, as you may know. and they have links to other East European countries, which I suppose I don't like, but whatever I like or don't like, they've decided to withhold. And I had read also reports that Chinese banks were not stepping up their bank loans, to Russia for one reason or another, for one product or another. And that caught my eye, I don't know, 3 or 4 days ago, because money in Russia has completely dried up. The U.S. and Western sanctions are working to a large extent. Better late than never. But, China's being very cautious about this. And I'll tell you one other thing, just sort of a sidelight. It's not exactly what you're getting at, but the fact that Russia is having so much trouble militarily, I mean, their army is underperforming very badly. I know that's overwhelming, and eventually they're going to succeed in some way, shape, or form. But it's a warning to China. They could go into Taiwan, but Taiwan will fight like hell, just like the Ukrainians have fought like hell. And it may not be so easy to exercise any interference with Taiwan's sovereignty. So there's a bit of a warning shot there, and I'm glad to see it.
Larry, you just brought up the Taiwan-China situation, and I'm fascinated to hear what you think would happen. We've seen all these American corporations, Disney, Apple, you basically Nike, anybody you name that has relationships with Russia, they've all backed off since the invasion of Ukraine and said we're not going to have anything to do with the Russians. What would they do if China invaded Taiwan, given comparatively wildly more economic power on the side of China?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I don't know what they do. I mean, Taiwan's a very strong economy. It's completely different than Russia. Taiwan is, a leading economy, like a top 10 or top 15 economy in terms of their size and their efficiency and productivity and whatnot. So I'm not sure how these big companies who are heavily invested in China would deal with Taiwan. It might be trickier, but the one area that is of international significance in Taiwan is not the entertainment or the media area; it's the semiconductor area. Taiwan Semiconductor is a powerhouse. It's a global powerhouse. We're trying to bring them to, they're going to be building a new plant in Arizona. I think they got something going on in the Northwest in Oregon, if I'm not mistaken. So that's the economic value added is all the semiconductor stuff, and that's really important. And by the way, worth protecting because if that ever got shut down. So I don't know how to answer your question. I really don't. Self-sanctioning, look, self-sanctioning is a very pleasant surprise by these American companies with respect to Ukraine. Very pleasant surprise. Not 100%, and we're still buying Russian oil, which is a terrible thing to finance Putin's war machine. But I'm impressed, and even in the oil and gas area, there's a lot of self-sanctioning going on. Refiners are looking, walking away from contracts. Bank lenders are walking away from financing. So if you go to Taiwan, I think a Chinese invasion would be looked at just as badly as the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Okay, Buck, that's my instinct here. You just can't do this stuff. In other words, the world has awoken to the threats, and that's very important. And I think Russia has opened up a can of worms they probably never even anticipated. So my hunch is China will have a real hard time going into Taiwan, and American companies would be very leery of helping China in any way, shape, or form.
Speaking of Larry, Kudlow, Fox News media contributor, his show Kudlow airs 4 Eastern on Fox Business Network, and obviously he was a senior economic advisor to Trump in the Trump administration. All right, Larry, if you heard the State of the Union, obviously, earlier in the week. If we got you in the room with Biden and, his National Economic Council and said, look, you got to tell them what needs to be done here with regard to Ukraine, specifically on the economy. What would you tell them they should do that they're not doing?
Drill, drill, drill. Completely change their policies regarding energy. This was the fatal flaw from day one. Sacrificing energy independence made us dependent on Russia. And it's incalculably stupid. And it has so much to do with this crazy war going on in the Ukraine and, Putin's grandiose ahistorical dreams of the Russian Empire. I mean, we have got to be using all of our resources. The thing is, I had Joe Manchin on the show last night. We had a long talk. And it used to be generally agreed upon in both political parties, going back for the last 30, 40 years, we had an all-of-the-above energy policy. We would develop fossil fuels, and we would develop renewables, and we would develop nuclear, and so forth. Now, what Biden has done, and much worse, Obama tried some of this stuff, but the fracking revolution came full steam on during the Obama years, and there's really not much they could do about it. And plus, Republicans had the Congress for a good chunk of his presidency. But what Biden has done is this extreme policy where it's no longer all the above. It's no more fossil fuels, all right? And it's everything, $550 billion of subsidies going into renewables and batteries and electric cars and all the rest of that stuff. This is a radical departure to these radical progressive climate people. And this has to be stopped. It must be stopped. And incidentally, it's not only about energy independence, it's about the whole economy. Look, fossil fuel powers the economy. And if they continue, or if they're allowed to continue, it will do enormous damage to jobs, family incomes, and things like that. It would be enormous damage to the GDP. There is no alternative universe here. You're not going to run an economy without fossil fuels. Right now it's about 75% of the economy. And by the by, I'm not against wind turbines. I'm not against solar panels and so forth. I'm just saying anybody who thinks you can get along without fossil fuels is literally out of their mind. And the Bidens are, in that respect, out of their mind. And they don't have they've never presented an alternative universe. They've never given us, here's how the structure is going to look like. And incidentally, the hypocrisy embedded in this view, in order to get, let's go to the electric automobiles and batteries and so forth, you're going to have to dig up a lot of commodities. And digging up a lot of commodities itself will be carbon intensive. Okay, that's going to create more emissions, not less. And we don't have those resources to do it. And the toll on prices, the cost of this would be just enormous. And, of course, the quantity of power would come down. It would raise inflation, and it would do great damage to the economy. That's the point. That's the single biggest mistake those guys have made. And I'm not even talking about their massive social spending and their attempts to transform both the economy and our culture, which is bad enough. I'm just saying on this one particular area, it is their single largest mistake.
We're talking to Larry Kudlow. He is a Fox News Media contributor, and his show, Kudlow, airs an hour after hours for Eastern Fox Business Network. Last question for you, Mr. Kudlow. Appreciate the time. We talked with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago last week, and part of our discussion centered around the question of whether or not Vladimir Putin would have invaded Ukraine if Trump were still president. You worked in the Trump White House. What's your take on that? Would Vladimir Putin have invaded Ukraine, in your opinion, if Trump were still the president of the United States?
I don't think so. I've read his public statements. I have not talked to him in the last 2 weeks. I talked to him a little bit. I talked to him a few days before the invasion. But look, just in generic terms, Donald Trump would have rattled Putin's cage, okay? If he had seen 150, 175,000 troop buildup on the east side of Ukraine, he would have gone on the phone and rattled Putin's cage, and I think that's the big difference. And the threats that Biden made, for example, about sanctions, just on that particular point, that he never implemented until it was too late. I mean, Trump would have just told him, you try this and X, Y, Z, we're going to cut this off, we're going to cut that off. And remember, a Trump presidency, we would have been energy independent. We were energy independent. We were producing over 13 million barrels a day. We didn't need Russia, okay? We were the swing producer, and we were independent, and we were actually exporting net exports of fossil fuels. So we would have said, we are going to shut you down immediately. We would have gone, go after your central bank. We're going to go after your oligarchs. We're going to go after your banks. We're going to go after your oil companies. We will, so that's my point. He would have rattled his cage big time, which he is capable of doing. I was in the room, I don't know how many times, with his phone calls, with world leaders and all the bilats that I attended in the cabinet room or in the UN or the G7. I was the Sherpa for the G7 and the G20. He wouldn't have tolerated it. And he would have told them right there, up close and personal, if you do this, this is going to happen. It's going to happen tomorrow. And that's why I think that's the difference between Biden and Putin.
Larry Kudlow. Larry, thanks so much for being with us here on Clay and Buck. We appreciate it, sir.
All right. Thanks very much. Pleasure.
Want to get right into it now with someone I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with. Dr. Oz is with us. He is running right now in the great state of Pennsylvania for Senate. He's a Republican candidate in that state, and you all know him from TV and being a doctor and all that good stuff. Dr. Oz, thanks for being with us.
Blessed to be with you. My brothers-in-law are avid listeners, so I get to show off to them today, which is hard to do in our family.
Well, that's fantastic. They clearly have very good taste, Doc. So tell us why. I mean, for a lot of folks, the most basic question before they're running for anything is the why. But, you're a celebrity. You're a doctor, and also you're a doctor who plays one on TV, too, because you are one. Why are you getting involved in this?
Too many days looking around at the walls and wondering, there must be cameras watching me. The country's in such a crisis, and no one seems to really be addressing elements of it. And especially got bad during COVID. I'd noticed it before, but since I knew medicine well, I could see mistakes made that were absolutely intolerable, and yet we stifled discussion. People who had better ideas were not given the opportunity to speak. It's one of the reasons I've asked for Dr. Fauci to resign. I've challenged him to a debate. I think that his desire to be the one and only solution for everything COVID has led to him helping cancel physicians, Nobel laureates, doctors, and scientists who had ideas that I think could have contributed and eased the pain of so many during COVID. I also witnessed firsthand errors in how we managed the pandemic with regard to mandates, where we took a meat cleaver to American civil liberties and our ability to actually to be independent, and individualism should drive those decisions, not government top-down authoritarian mandates.
Dr. Oz, appreciate you coming on with us. I'm curious what you think when you see on Monday Joe Biden walking wearing a huge mask as he crosses the White House lawn. And then last night during the State of the Union, there's basically no mask to be seen. He's shaking hands. He's headbutting people, believe it or not. It's such a bastardization, I would imagine, of the science argument to have one day a guy walking around outdoors with a mask on, the next day he's hugging and shaking hands and everything else. How frustrating is that to see as a doctor and recognize how poor of a job in many ways our government has explaining risk analysis and COVID?
What's shocking to me is they, with the hypocritical tone, say we're following the science. And what they're really doing is following the political science. This is all theater. It has been theater for quite a while. We see that when we look at red states versus blue states and their outcomes. But over the past 2 months, there's been a slow easing of these mandates in blue states, and especially over the last few weeks, because they realize people have had it. I mean, you can only be dishonest to a certain degree, and people, even in your own party, begin to revolt. And what you're describing is a classic example of leaders who are making draconian decisions about what people should suffer through, but not living through those same restrictions themselves. Restated, people with big backyards told people with no backyards early in the pandemic to stay indoors, and that's exactly where the virus was. So literally, not only were these authoritarian moves harmful indirectly because they lead to deaths of despair, but they were directly harmful. They didn't help us. They actually made things worse. And you can most clearly see this with kids. What society, what self-respecting people use their children as shields? We closed our schools down and never opened them in many parts of the country for such a long period that we may have caused irreparable harm to those kids. Yet early on I said, geez, the Europeans, they're keeping their schools open. Do they love their kids more than we love our kids? What's going on here? And I think those are the kinds of decisions, once made, they were unwilling to backtrack on. And then it's evolved into this, I believe in science maneuvering, which is just, first of all, I believe in God, right? Science is a tool. I'm a scientist, a doctor. I use science to help save lives, but it's something that's supposed to be challenged, supposed to be improved on. And we did not allow that to happen. And COVID is just an example. The same maneuvering, the same approach has been going on for quite a while. I lived through it. On my show, I would take on government issues frequently and get beaten back. At least they try to. And I'd be at porcupine about these issues, continue to strike back until we finally get the truth out there. But forget about COVID for a second. What's happening in energy policy, which directly led to what's happening in Ukraine? What's happening in our school system where we don't let parents and at least their values get shared with the kids while teachers are indoctrinating our kids with values that don't agree with ours. We see this at the border when you have false narratives and the true story of a cartel-run human trafficking operation doesn't actually reach the front pages. These are the kinds of things that bother us. And I'll end with China, because the real existential threat here is China. They've eaten our lunch. They steal from us, take advantage of us. They cheated everything, and they're watching Putin very carefully. And Xi's saying, I can't believe Putin got away with this much already. As horrible as it is, he's thinking, well, maybe I'll do the same thing with Taiwan. 10% of the world's semiconductors, 85% of the high-quality ones, all of it at risk because they see us as weak.
We're speaking to Mehmet Cengiz Oz. Dr. Oz, I hope I got that almost correct. Dr. Oz, as you all know him from TV, he's a surgeon, a healthcare advocate, and running for Senate in Pennsylvania. He's in the Republican primary right now. So with that in mind, Dr. Oz, how would you describe your political philosophy? Are you a conservative? Have you always been? Are you a more recent convert? I mean, what should people know about what your core, what your foundation of politics is?
I'm a conservative Republican, always have been. When I was 8 years of age, my father, who was an immigrant, who came here legally because the United States was recruiting physicians, told me we were Republicans. I asked him why, and he says, because they have better ideas. The realities of life are Republican. So my first election was 1980 for Ronald Reagan, who I voted for, and I'm proud to have voted for Republicans and have believed the Republican Party represents what conservative thought could be. Not all Republicans are conservative, but I am, and I feel strongly that the issues that galvanize me, and I'm pro-life, pro-Second Amendment in a big way. Every law-abiding American citizen ought to be allowed to own a firearm of their choice. These are all issues that are important here in Pennsylvania. And if you take it to the next step, what I really want to do is protect my children and your children. It's one of the reasons I decided to, close the show. By the way, I burned the boats, right? When you go into politics and you have you're hosting a syndicated network television show, you're not allowed to air that show because it's unfair because you're everywhere. And so I shut the show down, shut the magazine down, did all the things that I thought was right because I feel so passionately about this. And as a conservative, I know that some of the mistakes we've made are affecting our kids in ways that it will be more difficult to improve, because if the kids are taught to be Marxists, then they're not going to understand the very foundations of what conservatism represents.
You mentioned that show. I'm kind of curious about this. How much money did you walk away from? I like the burn the boats analogy. How much money did you walk away from to run for political office, where obviously, unless you're Joe Biden's family, you don't typically get super wealthy from it already, but you had to have a highly successful show. I'm just really intrigued by a decision like that because you're turning away probably tens of millions of dollars to be able to run for a political office.
That's the exact amount I walked away from. And listen, I've been blessed.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting discussion, right? Because there's a lot of people out there, you were saying, hey, I could make tens of millions of dollars, but I care so much about these issues that I'm willing to walk away from that money.
You know how deflating it is to sit in your safe little studio, air conditioned, lots of people pampering you, or in the operating room, because I still take care of patients, and it's pretty safe there if you're not the patient, and witness your country falling apart. What's the point of making a couple extra zeros of money when what has allowed my family to thrive and prosper, which is the generosity, wisdom, and strength of America, is being torn asunder, because people feel we are so irredeemably stained that the only way to fix us is to break us asunder into little pieces and then rebuild us with their toxic ideology. And I refuse to stand by and watch that happen. And it's okay if it doesn't work out. When hopefully years from now, as I try to live a healthy lifestyle, even on the campaign trail and diner food, years from now when I pass away, on my headstone, I wanted to read heart surgeon, TV host. If it happens to say senator, that's great too. I don't intend to go there and live in Washington the rest of my life. I'm trying to do an intervention to help.
Dr. Oz, I should have probably asked you at the top, given the news cycle right now, if you had a chance to watch some or all of the State of the Union address, and what your feeling is as somebody who wants to get into this fight about the current White House and the regime that's been calling the shots the last year or so.
I was not impressed by the State of the Union. Of course, I watched it. I watched the Republican response as well. It's disappointing that Joe Biden painted a vastly different picture of his first year in office than the disaster that's being experienced by the vast majority of Americans. I do these big town halls here in Pennsylvania. No one here thinks that's what's going on. We're worried about the record inflation we're experiencing. Gas prices, obviously, at 8-year high. I did a TikTok video, by the way, on gas prices that got 2 million views almost immediately. TikTok took it down, which, again, is part of the censoring that bothers me so much. I put it back up again because I've got 13 million people on social media, so I wanted to say, well, why are they taking it down? Now it has 7.5 million views. But why would I not be able to mention the reality of what the average American is suffering through right now? And these are issues that are addressable. Our energy policy makes zero sense. Especially if you look at the Ukraine, Joe Biden yesterday in the State of the Union should have designated key oil and gas projects in our country to be critical infrastructure for national security, and then to do everything to protect those efforts. Because right now, no one's going to get the natural gas out from under my feet in Pennsylvania, although we could power the whole country for a century and ship it to our European allies to free them from the yoke of Russia.
Dr. Oz, do you think that Oprah would vote for you if she were living in Pennsylvania?
I don't know. She's, I talked to her before I ran. I just to inform her. I asked her not to get involved because it's the right thing to do, and she agreed. So I have no idea. I think she'd have to, like everybody else in Pennsylvania, weigh what I'm saying, compare it to everybody else, and make the best choice of her ability. But the one thing I'm sure is that she would vote.
The other thing I was going to say about that is we talked a little bit about you coming out of the television studio and running for political office. You're a beloved guy. When you're the doctor who's trying to get everybody to be healthy, I mentioned to Oprah, you have a great relationship with them. You mentioned the millions of followers you have. And then you step into a fray where people start throwing punches at you. How much different does that feel than what you were doing beforehand, where you're sort of a non-ideological doctor figure who everybody kind of responds to in a favorable way, and then you step in and you start taking slings and arrows, so to speak. How has that been an adjustment for you?
It's going to surprise you. It's a very cathartic process. You don't have to pretend that refrain from saying things because people are going to get all upset about it. You can say exactly what you're thinking because people are going to vote based on that. And you are the person you are. So for me, it's been incredibly freeing. I love my show. I love talking about health. But when I got frustrated about, for example, what Fauci was doing, leading our public health response, I tried to say things, but after a while, people, they don't want you saying those things. And you've got incredible pressures to make sure you stay within a little cordon limit, which is why I know what it's like for corporate America right now. They don't want to get involved. I'm here to say you have to get involved. Be a patriot. Stand up for what you know is right. Say what you see. At these town halls, that's my one plea. I think you'd vote for me if you came and listened, because if you heard me speak, you'd want to be part of our campaign effort. But no matter what, just say what you're seeing. Because if you don't and no one else does, we're going to believe all this woke ideology that's suffocating our brains.
DrOz.com. Dr. Oz is running for the Senate, folks, in Pennsylvania. Dr. Oz, appreciate it, sir. Thanks so much.
Thanks for making me a hero to my brothers-in-law. God bless you.
Thank him for listening for us. Thank you.